Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. W.E.B. Du Bois famously wrote in 1903 in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. 6 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois, sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, joined others in founding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The organization grew to include branches all across the United States, including one here in Paducah. With me today is the longtime president of the Paducah branch, Jetty B. Cleary. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Barry.
Your tenure is almost 30 years, you said, and that would equal Curly Brown, who was president for 30 years. Tell us a little bit about him.
You know, Curly was a jewel of a person. And of course, back when Curly was president, things was really tough in this community throughout the United States. But Curly had a very passion for the NAACP because of the fact that he wanted to always take the attitude of trying to help make a difference. And a lot of the philosophy that Curly had is the same philosophy like myself and Dr. Martin Luther King, is the fact that we as the people have to come together as one by working together. Because I really truly feel like that we wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for people like Curly, to the point of whereas he took the attitude that we as Americans are in this battle together, white Americans as well as black Americans. So he would always make sure that he had the support of white Americans also. And the philosophy behind that was because of the fact that in order for a community to grow, we have to learn to work together as one.
Mm-hmm. Run across a quote from him. And he, by the way, of course, as you know, was in the Kentucky Civil Rights Hall of Fame. And he said, someone asked him, "What do you want?" And he replied, "I want the same things you want: a good job, a good education for my children, a car, and a nice home." That pretty well says it all, doesn't it?
That, you know, I've used that, and I didn't really realize that that was his quote. But that has been my thinking also, to the point of whereas that's what happens in the real world, to the point of whereas white Americans would ask us, what is it that will satisfy you? What do you want? And we would say the same thing. Well, I want the same thing that you want. You want a good place for your kids to have a good education and a good job, a good home, a good car to drive. Mm-hmm. It's really amazing that you made that quote from him, because mm-hmm. that's my thinking also. Mm-hmm. That's the attitude that I give.
Yeah. And his son, Curly Brown Jr., was the first graduate of Old Paducah Junior College, which became Paducah Community College, which is now West Kentucky Community and Technical College. Some of us oldsters still call it PCC. Have to catch ourselves doing that. The other thing too, going back, you're 62 years old.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember the Jim Crow era in Paducah?
I really do. I remember things like the theater that we had to go upstairs and throw things down at the people down below. I can remember even to the point of whereas we would pay our money. We would pay our money at the front door, walk out the back door, or walk out the door and go around to the side door. I can remember going to Bonton's Barbecue, and whereas if we wanted barbecue, we would have to go in the back door and order our barbecue. And I can even remember to the point of whereas going to the dentist's office. We would actually have to go upstairs to the dentist's office to get our teeth worked on. So I remember some of it, but I mean, of course, people like Curly would remember a whole lot of it, but I can remember bits and pieces of it.
Well, I'm 68, and I can remember things as well. I grew up in Mayfield. Same situation. And I used to always stress to my students that this took place in the 1960s. This is recent history. The segregation was rigid. Schools were segregated. Neighborhoods were segregated. Everything was segregated. In fact, I can tell you, I grew up in an all-white neighborhood. I never had physical contact with an African American child until I was about 12 or 13. The fellow who picked up our trash honestly had a wagon pulled by a mule. I remember it had car tires on it. And he brought his son one day. And so I showed him my new Bell telephone toy truck, and we played ball in the backyard. I had never physically come in contact with an African American child until that time. That's how segregated it was. Mule Covington's restaurant in Mayfield, same thing. You got to go in the back to eat. My grandmother died in 1964. She was at the old Mayfield Hospital, which is long gone, and my brother and I were visiting her. And kids being kids, we decided to explore the elevator, which was pretty novel to us, I guess. And so we rode the elevator up and down. When we rode it down to the basement, the door opens up. There's a whole room full of African American patients. That was the quote unquote colored ward. And I always reminded my students, you remember the movie Driving Miss Daisy?
Right.
When Hoke stops to urinate, he goes behind a billboard. Why didn't he go to a service station? You know why? Because he couldn't. The McCracken County Courthouse had toilets, white and colored, as it was the same thing all across. Segregation was rigid, and kids, they absolutely are stunned to know schools are segregated. Everything was segregated. I remember reading an article in a book about the civil rights movement in which the author said that a white Southerner's idea of heaven was two turnstiles, one marked white and the other colored. And the NAACP played a huge role in changing all that.
But you know, you brought up a good point. And of course, to go along, I can even remember when the bus station, in other words, you actually had a colored waiting area and the white waiting area.
Yeah.
But also, you brought up a good point about you seeing the garbage person and you talking to his son or whatever. That's what we've always said in the past, is the fact that once you're around African Americans, you find out that, hey, a lot of their likes and wants is no different than yours. So that's the reason why that I do not take the attitude of blaming the white American, because of the fact that was the way they were brought up. So therefore, what tended to happen is the fact that they were taught the way they acted or whatever. We played, in fact, I was gifted enough to have a mother that was, I guess, we grew up whereas it was white kids as well as black kids in our neighborhood. But when it was time to eat or for lunch or whatever, in other words, the white kids and the black kids, we were all right there together, because my mother didn't believe in that we were being separate. In other words, we had to learn to communicate together. And that was one of the biggest problems, is with communication. Once we communicated, that's the reason why that we've always, I've stuck by that quote to Dr. King, that we have to learn to sit down at the table of brotherhood, but you got to have an open mind. You got to learn to give and take.
And of course, as you know, the NAACP always had whites as well as African Americans. Not just an African American organization; they're whites and that involved in that as well. We had talked earlier about the importance of the political process. This is a democracy, and of course, the one thing that, sad to say, so many Americans, white people of color, don't do is vote. That, and I remember back when the Voting Rights Act was passed, 1965, and I remember a good friend of ours, W.C. Young, put out little buttons, and they said, "Vote, baby, vote." Do you remember those buttons he put out?
You know, W.C. Young and W.G. Harvey, in other words, those guys, they worked right along with Curly Brown, and I had the opportunity to work closer probably with them than I did Curly. They always took the attitude that once we got that opportunity to vote, that we got to learn to use it. But what tended to happen was people would sit on the sideline and think that everything was going to come to them in a way of speaking, and whereas that was one of the tools that we had that we could really and truly make a difference, because you take the attitude that once you go in that voting booth, regardless who you are, how much money you had, what color your skin, but you had the same opportunity as anybody else, is pulling that leverage. So that's the reason why even today's world, that we take the NAACP takes the attitude that voting is one of the most important parts. You know, a lot of time people dwell on registering to vote. That's fine, registering, but go to the polls and vote. And that was one of the things that we grew up in my household, to the point of whereas if you don't do nothing else, you will vote once you got the age or old enough to vote, that you will vote if you're going to live in this household. And that's my same philosophy, even to my kids today, is the point of whereas I don't care what you do, but you vote. And the uniqueness of that is, Barry, is the fact that records are kept. In other words, they're kept to the point of whereas you're either a voter or you're not a voter, or how often you vote, when you vote, and the whole 9 yards. So I just think that the voting process, the political process, is one of the greatest tools that we as not only African Americans, even poor white Americans, in other words, that's the tool that we can use that could make a difference.
And to me, one of the great ironies of American society is the demographic that votes the most often is our demographic, older people. I've never understood why a young person, 18 years old, whole life's ahead of them, going to be affected a whole lot more by the political process than us, but yet they don't vote. Any input, why do young people, so many young people, not vote? Why don't they understand the importance of that to their lives?
You know, that's been a question that's been asked so many times, and I don't really know exactly what the answer is, but I will say this. We can't take for granted that they won't, because I think that they're doing a whole lot greater than they used to. You know, even back in the civil rights movement, in other words, it was young folks that made a difference.
That's true.
That a lot of the things that happened, it would have never happened if it wasn't for the young folks. And even in today's world, I mean, with the school shooting and this type of thing, it's the young folks that's making more difference than we as older folks have ever done. So, and even with the NAACP, I noticed, by us always try to tell young or branches or NAACP branches coming up, make sure you got young folks involved, because what tend to happen is older people will support younger folks more so than they will the older folks. So the young folks are so important in the process.
Before the program, you also mentioned the importance of the media. Talk about that.
Well, the media, to me, you know, when I came into the NAACP, even here local, that it was always, when you talked about the NAACP, it was like secretly, or you don't tell everybody if you're going out of town and stuff like that, because of all the stuff that have happened for the bombing and people, if you a mover and a shaker in your community, that you had some bad people in anything, and you had the bad people that take the attitude that you know, they would try to maybe destroy the people that's trying to make a difference. But I truly believe in my heart, and in fact, they're making a segment on this thing, or they finding out that the news media was the most valuable tool that the NAACP had, or Black Americans had, even during the Civil Rights Movement. It was the media that focused on what was going on in the Civil Rights Movement. The reason why that when it was time for marches with Dr. King or whatever, that the fact that, man, I cannot believe that they're treating these people, Americans, this way. So when even me today is when we have a program, I make a point. I have a personal contact with the news media, and I will tell them, I'm going to say, if you got something, if something goes on that you want to know, be sure and call me, especially if it happens in the African American community, because I believe that I can help you, because I know that what tends to happen is the news media is so important. If you let people know what's going on, then that will make your program, the NAACP and Black Americans, we can go to higher heights, because the news media does make a difference. We saw it in the 60s, and we see it today's world, that it does make a difference.
I can still remember, and I know you can too, those black and white photos of Bull Connors in Birmingham, dogs, fire hoses being turned on African Americans. That shocked and horrified the whole country. Yes, absolutely, such a powerful. I can still remember Dr. King's funeral when they carried his body in a wagon, I believe drawn by mules.
Exactly.
That was very, very deeply moving. You're absolutely right about that. Something else you talked about too was donations. Pretty significant folks in Paducah have given money to the NAACP. Talk a little bit about that.
You know, it first started out, it was a black American, T.R., I never will forget it, T.R. Rudder.
Oh, I've heard that name,
right.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Rudder, you know, he was an insurance salesman here in Paducah for many, many years.
Do you know when the chapter was founded?
In 1929.
Wow, that's
right here in Paducah,
wow.
Kentucky, 1929.
Wow. Yeah.
It's really amazing, but it was people, the older folks. I mean, I've seen records whereas membership was like $1, for instance, but you had people like Mr. Rudder that really believed in the NAACP of making a difference down the road. So he donated $40,000. And of course, back years ago, $40,000 in today's world is not a lot of money, but years ago, that was a lot of money.
Yeah.
But that was what, in other words, it got to the point whereas people of color started having decent jobs and this type of thing. So in his will, he made sure that the NAACP was left this $40,000, and of course that was a big help to us. But then later on, then you had the Clyde and Lanero Broyles. They left the NAACP $116,000 endowment. So, and the uniqueness of an endowment is the fact that it's going to be there forever. And all we can get is the interest off of it. And of course, the way it was set up is the fact that what that endowment has done is that we would have scholarships set up right here at the community college. Now here, Clyde and Lanero was white Americans, but these scholarships, and not to take anything away from anybody, but he knew that the playing field was not level. So therefore, whatever he could do to help African Americans, he took the attitude that it would help all Americans right here in the city of Paducah. So he left us that $116,000. And then a few years ago, or 8 or 10 years ago, then there was Fred Paxton. Fred Paxton left the NAACP $1 million. And what that $1 million was designed for is to help level the playing field for we as African Americans. And I know sometimes white Americans take the attitude that, well, why does he just focus towards black Americans? Well, he took the attitude, and I asked him that question one time. I said, Mr. Paxton, why did you leave that $1 million to a black organization? He said, well, JW, I took the attitude that I've been watching you over the years. And of course, I'm crying like a baby when he was telling me this story. And he said, it just appears that you seem like that you want to you got some of the same beliefs that I have, is trying to help make a difference. So this $1 million, all we can draw is the interest from that $1 million. So therefore, that $1 million is going to be there forever. But we, knowing that the NAACP is under the branch of a national organization, well, if the national organization go defunct, then they could come and wipe out all the subordinate branches. So we made sure when we set that up that endowment, in fact, that was the birth of the McCracken County Career Endowment. We actually formed a group just for this $1 million. And of course, the story is the fact that, and it's now all history to the point, that group has given out over $300,000 just to scholarships alone. But not only scholarships, they try to encourage teachers to come to the area. So we allow $1,000 just for your moving expense to come to this area. We're taking the attitude of trying to help out. And even some of the organizations that help our kids, because education is so important. In other words, the fact that we no need of inventing the wheel, so we try to help the other organizations to try to make sure their program is successful.
A little while ago, you mentioned W.G. Harvey. Interesting, if I knew him well. What do you remember about W.G. Harvey?
Well, let me make sure that the record is set clear. W.G. Harvey, to me, of course, W.G. Harvey was one of my mentors, like Dr. King, like the Curly Brown, like W.C. Young. But WG, I guess we worked probably closer together than any of the people through the civil rights movement, because of the fact that he was to the point of whereas WG had some of the same beliefs that I had. In other words, I felt so strongly about WG to the point of whereas if he say jump, I would actually say, me being a new kid on the block, being young, I would say, how high do you want me to go? That was how much I believed in him. And of course, history says that the fact that, and I saw it from my own eyes, that WG and WC Young, they worked hand in hand together. In fact, they went to Frankfurt. They went went to the United States Capitol. I mean, they did everything together, just trying to make sure that Paducah got its part. But WG was one of the persons that helped integrate for us going to restaurants right here in Paducah.
He did.
Because he went to the old
Boswell.
Boswell
Oh, I know
restaurant.
that story.
That's exactly right.
He told me that story.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. He came from Indiana. And of course, Indiana didn't have Jim Crow laws, but there was segregation in Indiana. Absolutely,
was one of the
it was
states.
De facto segregation. Absolutely right. So he told me the story. He came to the Harrison Street Church here, and so one day it was time for lunch. He told his secretary, "Let's go to lunch." He says, "All right." And I got in the car, and she says, "Where are we going to go?" He said, "We're going to go to Boswell's Park Avenue." Well, he said the secretary almost jumped out of the car, and they pulled up in the parking lot and went in, and just full of white people. Now we're looking like, what is this? And he said he went in and he sat down, and he said Mr. Boswell himself came to him and shook his hand and said, "I'm glad you did this. This needed to be done." And that was back in, I guess, the early 60s. And again, students don't realize how bold that was.
Right.
And another thing, too, about Jim Crow, as you know, was held in place by violence or the threat of violence. Lynchings happened here in Paducah, all over western Kentucky, not just Mississippi, burning.
Right in front of the courthouse.
It was right here. So to do that is astonishing. He told me another story, I'll never forget, to the extent of segregation. Of course, water fountains were separate, as you know. He said that in some stores, African Americans could not try on clothes or shoes. In stores right here in Paducah.
Right.
And again, then there was this, this actually was over at Kresge's, which remember Kresge's had the lunch counter and all that. Gladman Humbles told me the protocol there was even weirder. An African American could stand up at the counter, but he couldn't sit down at a table, which is just bizarre, the lengths. And you talk about the movie theater, same as in Mayfield, about that. But anyway, he said at the Paducah, I believe it was the Public Works office, there was an old-fashioned drink box.
I remember it. Go ahead.
And again, my students don't understand what a drink box is. We remember those. And he said it was painted half black and half white. African Americans would get Cokes only out of the black end of the box. And my student looked at me like, "Are you making this up?" And I said, "No, I'm not." Case in point, Janet Blythe, who was the public relations officer, marketing now here at the college. She's a Air Force, grew up, her dad was at Career Air Force, grew up in Mayfield. And I was telling these stories about Mayfield being segregated. She said, that's just astonishing. She grew up in the Air Force, everything was desegregated. I said, "Go ask your dad about it." And she did, and he said, "Yeah, that's what Mayfield was like." And again, I always stress, this is the 1960s, the 1970s, not the 1860s and 70s. This went on to that point. But again, it's amazing. And by the way, W.G. Harvey and W.C. Young both came to Frankfurt in '64 when Martin Luther King marched. They were part of that crowd. And I think it's, of course, I taught history, obviously, is one of my passions. But I really think that if people understand the history of an organization, any organization, it makes it meaningful. And and W.C. Young, talk about W.C. Young is first cousin to Robert Coleman, I believe.
Exactly, he is.
And so tell me about W.C. I knew him well, but tell the viewers about W.C. Young.
W.C. Young was probably, in fact, W.C., I thought so much of him that I probably wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for people like W.C. Young. W.C. Young, I'm a member of the Lounge Club. In fact, I'm a past president of the Breakfast Lounge Club. And of course, I'm in the Paducah Lounge Club now. And I'm going to come up for president for that. But W.C. Young took the attitude that he would tell me, he said, "J.W., you have to be involved in white Americans' process also. He said that you cannot expect white Americans to participate in your process, being the NAACP or other black organizations, and then of course, even when I think of Fred Paxton, I even think that Fred Paxton was even one of the members, chartered members of the old Paducah Brotherhood Association.
I remember that.
So, in other words, he would say that you got to get involved. So I made sure that I joined the Chamber of Commerce. I made sure that I was a member of the Lions Club. I participate in the political process. I participate, even tried to work with I'm on the committee with the Paducah Police Department. I go to the commission meetings sometimes. I go to the county commission sometimes. In other words, you got to be in the process, because a lot of times it's when you have these meetings, there's no African Americans at the table. But it's so important for a community to grow to as highest heights by working together. We as African Americans and white Americans got to learn to work together. We're not doing it for ourselves, but what'll happen is those people that don't reach back to help our young folks, then therefore, as far as I'm concerned, you've done nothing. You got to help our young folks, and if we can work together, then the sky is the limit. That's the philosophy behind W.C. Young, W.G. Harvey, Fred Paxton, Clyde Broad. This was the philosophy behind these guys. We got to learn to work together as one.
Mm-hmm. Last question, we're almost out of time. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Is that still true in the 21st century?
It is, but you know, I take the attitude, Barry, that we can't constantly dwell on negative or the way it used to be. I really and truly believe that it's little things that happens in today's world that are making a difference. I never will forget, we just had our Martin Luther King essay contest, and this guy was at he's a doctor here in town. He was at the program, and he sent me a letter, and of course his child was one of the winners. In fact, she didn't even win. She got second, I think, is what it amounted to. But he said that he appreciated the fact that the NAACP had a program set aside to try to educate his daughter. And I just thought, he just wrote me a little note, and he said, here's $100, just a token of appreciation. But these are the type of little things that truly makes a difference, that makes you want to just keep on trying to do what you think is right.
Mm-hmm. In the few seconds we have left, how can people learn about the Paducah branch of the NAACP? Is there a contact phone number?
Well, I would just say that just get in touch with me, or just go on Facebook or website. In other words, the modern technology is so advanced now, and if you want to be a member, all you got to do is just say you want to be a member.
Technology is beyond me.
And you know, you brought up a point about whether it was a black it's not a black it's a people organization. We wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for white Americans, and that's the attitude. It was white folks that helped start the NAACP on the national level.
We're out of time. Enjoyed it as always. My guest today was J.W. Cleary, president of the Paducah branch of the NAACP. I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.